an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Margaret Sloane's gloved hands tightened around her leather-bound notebook as she stood before the imposing iron gates of Rivenhall House. The Duke's tall figure appeared at the top of the marble stairs, his face impassive as stone, watching her approach with cool assessment. Behind him, 4 elegantly dressed young women waited in a perfect row, their hopeful smiles masking calculation as they competed for a title and security Margaret would never possess. She felt the weight of the Dowager Duchess's scrutiny from a nearby window, measuring her worth and finding it insufficient. When the Duke's eyes met hers across the formal garden, something unexpected passed between them, a flash of recognition that neither had anticipated and neither could afford to acknowledge. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive as Margaret Sloane approached Rivenhall House. Spring sunlight illuminated the limestone facade, making the windows gleam like watchful eyes. She smoothed her gray traveling dress, serviceable and proper, like herself. "Mrs. Sloane," the butler announced, his voice echoing in the marble entrance hall. Margaret entered with the quiet dignity that had become her hallmark since her husband's death 3 years prior. At 32, she had learned to move through the world with careful precision, neither asking for attention nor shrinking from necessary visibility. "His Grace will see you in the library," the butler continued, leading her through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, generations of veils, with the same proud bearing and cool, assessing eyes. The library doors opened to reveal a room that, unlike the formal spaces they had passed, showed signs of actual habitation. Books lay open on tables. Papers were arranged in neat stacks, and sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking geometric gardens. "Mrs. Sloane." The Duke of Rivenhall rose from behind his desk, a tall figure in dark clothing. Alaric Vale, 12th Duke of Rivenhall, was not handsome in the conventional sense, but his features carried authority, deep-set eyes, a straight nose, and a mouth that suggested it. It rarely smiled without purpose. "Your Grace." Margaret curtsied, the movement practiced and efficient. "Please, be seated." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Quite, thank you." She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight but not rigid. He studied her for a moment. "Lady Harrington speaks highly of your discretion and judgment. Her ladyship is generous." "She is rarely generous without cause." A slight quirk of his eyebrow suggested this might be humor. "You understand why you've been summoned?" "Only in general terms, Your Grace." "Lady Harrington mentioned you required assistance with a matter of household organization." The Duke leaned back slightly. "I require a wife, Mrs. Sloane." Margaret's expression remained composed, though she had not expected such directness. "I see." "Not for romantic reasons," he clarified, his tone matter-of-fact. "I have responsibilities to this estate and my title. An heir is required. A suitable duchess is necessary, and you wish me to find her." He rose and walked to the window. "I have neither the time nor the inclination for the usual social circuit. The season is tedious, and the matchmaking mamas are relentless." Margaret processed this unusual proposition. "You wish me to identify potential candidates, to select them, assess them, and prepare them for final consideration." He turned back to her. "You would reside here for the duration, interview prospective candidates, and determine which young ladies possess the qualities necessary to manage this household and bear the title." "A bride finder," she said softly. "A practical solution to a practical matter." His gaze was direct. "You are a clergyman's widow, educated, observant. You understand propriety, without being bound by the usual social ambitions. Lady Harrington says you can read character well." Margaret considered his words carefully. "May I ask what qualities you seek in a duchess?" "Intelligence, composure, the ability to manage a large household, good health, appropriate lineage." He listed these attributes as one might inventory estate requirements. "She need not love me, nor I her. But we must respect each other's domains. And if I were to accept this position, you would be compensated generously. Upon successful completion, you would receive a sum sufficient to secure your independence for several years." The proposition was unexpected, unconventional, and yet practical. like the Duke himself. I would require complete authority in the selection process, Margaret said, surprising herself with her boldness. The candidates must understand they are being evaluated, but the final assessment would be mine alone to present to you. A flicker of something, approval, perhaps, crossed his face. Agreed. And I would need access to all household areas to understand what kind of mistress Rivenhall requires. Sensible. He nodded. My mother, the Dowager Duchess, resides in the East Wing. She will not interfere, though she may observe. Margaret took a deep breath. I accept your proposition, Your Grace. Excellent. He returned to his desk and rang a small bell. Mrs. Winters will show you to your quarters. We shall begin tomorrow. As the housekeeper appeared to escort her, Margaret caught the Duke studying her with a curious intensity. Not the way men sometimes looked at women, assessing beauty or potential pleasure, but as one might examine a newly discovered species, with detached interest and perhaps a touch of wariness. One final question, Your Grace, Margaret said at the door. Why not simply have your mother or another female relation make these arrangements? His expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes hardened slightly. Because you, Mrs. Sloane, have nothing to gain beyond your fee, no daughter to advance, no social connection to secure. Your judgment will be unclouded by personal interest. As she followed Mrs. Winters up the grand staircase, Margaret wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake or taken the first step toward an unexpected future. Margaret rose early the next morning, the pale spring light filtering through damask curtains. Her room, spacious but not ostentatious, reflected Rivenhall House itself, elegant, functional, and somewhat removed from warmth. She dressed in her best day dress, a deep navy that suggested authority without seeking attention. At her writing desk, she opened a fresh leather-bound notebook and began to create her system. If the Duke wanted a methodical approach to matrimony, she would provide exactly that. By breakfast time, she had developed categories for assessment: household management aptitude, educational background, social grace, family connections, temperament, and health. Each would be rated discreetly on a scale she devised. Mrs. Sloane. The Duke nodded as she entered the morning room. He sat alone at the table, newspapers and correspondence arranged precisely beside his plate. Your Grace. She took the seat a footman pulled out for her. I've prepared a preliminary framework for the selection process. He glanced up, a hint of approval in his expression. Efficient. I've also drafted a letter that might be sent to potential candidates' families, explaining the nature of the invitation without being overly direct. The Duke set down his coffee cup. May I see it? Margaret passed him the draft. He read it quickly, his expression unchanged. This is well done, he said finally. Discreet yet clear to those who understand such matters. Thank you, Your Grace. I've taken the liberty of compiling an initial list. He handed her a folded paper. 20 names. All meet the basic requirements of lineage and circumstance. Margaret scanned the list. Daughters of earls, barons, and wealthy landowners, all unmarried, between 18 and 25. I shall begin sending invitations today, she said. Perhaps 4 at a time, for a week's stay each. That would allow proper assessment without overwhelming the household. Sensible. He returned to his correspondence. Mrs. Winters will assist with any arrangements. Within a fortnight, the first candidates arrived. Lady Sophia Blackwood, Lord Hartington's youngest daughter, possessed flawless manners and musical accomplishment. Miss Eleanor Fitzwilliam brought impeccable connections and a dowry that would impress even a duke. Lady Jane Pembroke had beauty and gentle charm, while Miss Catherine Thornfield carried herself with the confident poise of someone raised to command attention. Margaret observed them at breakfast, at afternoon tea, during walks in the garden. She noted how Lady Sophia's perfect posture never relaxed, how Miss Fitzwilliam's eyes constantly assessed the value of every object. She watched Lady Jane's nervous deference to authority and Miss Thornfield's subtle but constant positioning for advantage. In the evenings, the Duke joined them for dinner. He was unfailingly polite, asking appropriate questions and listening with apparent interest. Yet Margaret noticed how his gaze occasionally drifted to the windows, as if seeking escape. On the third evening, after the young ladies had retired, Margaret found herself alone with the Duke in the library. "Your initial impressions, Mrs. Sloane?" he asked, pouring himself a small brandy. "They are all suitable in different ways," she answered carefully. Lady Sophia would maintain impeccable standards. Miss Fitzwilliam understands social hierarchies intimately. Lady Jane would never challenge your authority. Miss Thornfield would represent the title with confidence. "You haven't said what you recommend." Margaret hesitated. "I believe more observation is required before making such a determination." He studied her over the rim of his glass. "You're being diplomatic." "I'm being thorough," she corrected gently. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Very well. Continue your assessment." The next morning, Margaret implemented the second phase of her evaluation. She arranged for Mrs. Winters to report a minor household crisis, a leak in the linen storage that threatened valuable tablecloths, from her discreet position in the adjacent room. Margaret observed each young lady's response. Lady Sophia immediately suggested replacing the damaged items and reprimanding the responsible staff. Miss Fitzwilliam calculated the financial loss with remarkable precision. Lady Jane appeared distressed, but offered no solution. Miss Thornfield efficiently directed servants to salvage what could be saved. Later, Margaret tested their interactions with staff by having them each request special accommodations. She noted who expressed gratitude, who expected immediate compliance, who noticed the servants as people rather than functions. By week's end, she had filled several pages with observations. None were unsuitable. Yet none seemed quite right for Rivenhall House. As the first group departed and the second arrived, Margaret found herself increasingly aware of what the household truly needed. Not merely a manager of things, but a presence that could transform the immaculate emptiness into something more alive. The Duke, she noticed, was watching her as much as he watched the candidates. One afternoon, as she supervised tea in the garden, she felt his gaze from a library window above. When she glanced up, he didn't look away, but nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of their shared purpose. The second group of candidates proved similar to the first, accomplished, appropriate, and somehow insufficient. Margaret expanded her notes, refining her criteria based on what she was learning about Rivenhall itself. "You're unusually quiet tonight," the Duke observed after the second group's final dinner. "I'm considering adjustments to the process," Margaret admitted. "Explain." She chose her words carefully. "I've been evaluating the candidates based on conventional requirements, but I'm beginning to think Rivenhall has specific needs that may not align with conventional expectations, such as, this house runs efficiently, Your Grace, but it lacks animation. The right Duchess might bring life without disrupting order." He studied her with unexpected intensity. "You believe I need someone to disrupt my carefully arranged existence, Mrs. Sloane?" "Not disrupt," she clarified. "Compliment." For a moment, something unguarded flickered across his face, a recognition, perhaps, that she was seeing beyond his controlled exterior. Then it was gone. "Interesting theory," he said, his tone neutral once more. "I look forward to seeing how it informs your next selections." As she retired that night, Margaret realized they had achieved a kind of understanding, a mutual respect, that had grown quietly beneath the formal structure of their arrangement. It was nothing personal, of course. Merely professional recognition between two people, committed to doing their work well, at least. That's what she told herself as she added a new category to her assessment criteria: capacity to bring warmth without disorder. The third group of candidates arrived as May turned the gardens lush. Margaret had refined her selection, choosing young ladies who possessed not just accomplishment, but a certain thoughtfulness. Lady Caroline Howard brought intellectual curiosity along with her title. Miss Amelia Weston had a genuine interest in estate management. Lady Elizabeth Montague's quiet compassion showed in her interactions with servants. Miss Diana Russell combined social grace with unexpected practicality. On their second afternoon, Margaret led them on a tour of the estate's home farm. The Duke, returning from business in the village, joined them unexpectedly. "Ladies," he dismounted, handing the reins to a groom. "I trust Mrs. Sloane is providing an informative tour." The young women curtsied, their responses appropriately enthusiastic. Only Miss Weston asked a substantive question about crop rotation, which the Duke answered with evident knowledge. As they continued walking, Margaret noticed how the Duke maintained a careful distance, polite but reserved. She had seen this pattern repeatedly. Engagement without connection, attention without interest. Later that evening, passing the library, she heard voices. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing the Duke in conversation with an older woman Margaret recognized as his mother. She moved to continue past, not wishing to eavesdrop, when the dowager's words carried clearly into the hallway. Your first marriage may have been a disappointment, Alaric, but that's no reason to approach this one with such detachment. Lady Caroline has excellent connections. My first marriage was not merely disappointing, Mother. It was empty. His voice held a controlled tension Margaret had not heard before. I will not repeat that mistake. Empty. You had a duchess who understood her position perfectly. She understood position, yes. She never understood me, nor I her. We occupied the same house as polite strangers until her death. Margaret should have walked away. Instead, she remained frozen, hearing in his words an echo of her own experience. And you think this unusual selection process will yield something different? The dowager's tone was skeptical. I think it removes the illusions of courtship. There will be no pretense, no false expectations. Whoever becomes the next Duchess of Rivenhall will know exactly what she is accepting. Margaret finally forced herself to move, continuing down the corridor with her mind unsettled. The Duke's first marriage, something never mentioned in her presence, suddenly explained much about his approach. The next morning, in the estate's small archive room where she sometimes worked, Margaret found herself reflecting on her own marriage. Reverend Thomas Sloane had been kind, respectable, and utterly uninterested in knowing her mind. They had lived together for 5 years in perfect politeness and complete disconnection. Mrs. Sloane. The Duke's voice startled her from her thoughts. Your Grace, she rose quickly. Forgive the interruption. Mrs. Winters mentioned you might be here. He glanced at her open notebook. How do our current candidates compare to the previous groups? More promising in certain respects, she answered carefully. Miss Weston shows genuine interest in estate matters. Lady Elizabeth has a natural kindness that staff respond to well. He nodded, moving to the window. And their understanding of what this position would require. Margaret considered her response. They understand the formal requirements, Your Grace. Whether they comprehend the personal reality is harder to assess. He turned to face her, his expression unusually direct. You overheard my conversation with my mother last night. It wasn't a question. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but maintained her composure. I passed the library and heard voices. I should have continued immediately. But, yes, I heard something of your discussion. Then you know I was married before. Yes, Your Grace. What else did Lady Harrington tell you of me before you came here? Very little, Margaret admitted. Only that you were seeking a duchess for practical reasons, and that you valued directness and efficiency. A faint smile touched his lips. Accurate if incomplete. He paused. My first wife, Duchess Elaine, was the perfect aristocratic spouse in all visible ways. She managed the household flawlessly, performed her social duties without error, and never once expressed a genuine thought or feeling in our 3 years of marriage. Margaret remained silent, sensing he rarely spoke of this. When she died of fever, I mourned appropriately, but there was nothing real to mourn. His voice held no self-pity, only a matter-of-fact recognition. I will not subject another woman, or myself, to such an arrangement again. Hence your unusual approach to finding a duchess, Margaret said softly. Hence Mrs. Margaret Sloane, bride finder. He studied her. Did you have a happy marriage? The directness of the question surprised her. It was correct, she answered carefully. My husband was a good man. We never quarreled. That doesn't answer my question. Margaret met his gaze. No, it wasn't happy. It was quiet and predictable, and empty of true connection. When he died, I grieved the man he might have been. Had either of us known how to reach across the silence, something shifted in the Duke's expression. A recognition, perhaps, of shared experience. That, he said quietly, is precisely what I wish to avoid in my next marriage. I don't seek grand passion, Mrs. Sloane. I seek the possibility of genuine understanding. Before she could respond, a knock at the door announced Mrs. Winters, who required the Duke's attention on a household matter. He excused himself with a nod, leaving Margaret with the unsettling awareness that she had just shared more of herself with Alaric Vale than she had with anyone in years. That evening, during dinner, Margaret observed the Duke with new understanding. His reserve wasn't coldness, but a carefully constructed protection. The candidates chatted and smiled, each presenting her best self, while the Dowager Duchess watched from the head of the table with calculating eyes. The Dowager caught Margaret's gaze and held it for a moment, her expression clearly communicating that she had noticed something in Margaret's attention to her son, something she did not approve of. Margaret looked away first, suddenly aware of how precarious her position might become. If anyone suspected her professional assessment was becoming colored by personal understanding. Later, as the ladies retired for the evening, the Dowager paused beside Margaret's chair. "A word of advice, Mrs. Sloane," she said quietly. "Remember your purpose here. It would be unfortunate if anyone confused your role as facilitator with something more presumptuous." The warning was clear. Margaret nodded respectfully, but as she climbed the stairs to her room, she felt a growing tension between her duty and her deepening insight into what, or who, might truly bring life to Rivenhall House. The final group of candidates arrived in early June, when the gardens had reached their full glory. Among them was Lady Victoria Harrow, daughter of the Earl of Westfield, beautiful, accomplished, and possessed of a serene confidence that set her apart from previous candidates. From the moment of her arrival, it was clear Lady Victoria understood the unspoken purpose of these visits. She engaged intelligently with the Duke on estate matters, demonstrated flawless social grace, and showed appropriate interest in Rivenhall's history. Her family connections were impeccable, her dowry substantial, her manners beyond reproach. "She seems ideal," Mrs. Winters remarked to Margaret, as they observed Lady Victoria charming the household staff with just the right balance of authority and appreciation. "Yes," Margaret agreed, ignoring the inexplicable heaviness in her chest. "She appears to meet all the requirements." On the third day of Lady Victoria's visit, Margaret arranged individual interviews with each candidate, ostensibly to discuss their impressions of Rivenhall. In reality, these conversations were a final assessment of their suitability. Lady Victoria's interview was scheduled last. As Margaret waited in the morning room, she reviewed her notes on the previous candidates. None had shown Lady Victoria's perfect combination of qualities. By any objective measure, she should recommend her without hesitation. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The Duke entered, his expression unreadable. "Your Grace." Margaret rose, surprised by his appearance. "I'm expecting Lady Victoria momentarily." "I know." He closed the door behind him. "I've come to cancel the interview." Margaret blinked in confusion. "Has something occurred?" "Nothing dramatic." He moved to the window, looking out at the formal gardens. "I simply see no need to continue the assessment." A cold feeling settled in Margaret's stomach. "You've made your decision, then?" In a manner of speaking, he turned to face her. "Lady Victoria is perfect." "Yes," Margaret agreed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "By every measure I established, she would make an excellent duchess. And that is precisely why I cannot marry her." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I don't understand." The Duke's expression softened slightly. "Lady Victoria deserves a husband who would appreciate her perfection, who would love her for it." He paused. "I would give her the title, the position, the security, and nothing of myself. It would be cruel. But that was always the arrangement," Margaret said carefully. "A practical marriage without romantic expectations." "Yes," he met her gaze directly. "But I've come to realize there's a difference between a marriage without romantic illusions and one without possibility of genuine connection." Margaret felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of understanding that went beyond their formal roles. "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "Conclude your interviews with the others." "Well, thank them appropriately for their visit. He moved toward the door, then paused. There's a garden party tomorrow at Lord Pembroke's estate. I'm expected to attend. I'd like you to accompany me. The request was so unexpected that Margaret momentarily lost her composure. Me? But surely that would be inappropriate. I'm your employee, not. You're the person managing my household affairs in this matter, he interrupted. Your presence would be entirely proper in that context. Something in his tone suggested there was more to this invitation than practical considerations, but Margaret couldn't allow herself to consider such possibilities. As you wish, Your Grace, she said finally. The next day, Margaret wore her best afternoon dress, a deep burgundy that, while not fashionable, was dignified and appropriate. The Dowager Duchess observed her preparation with thinly veiled disapproval. I understand you're accompanying my son to the Pembrokes today, she remarked, appearing in Margaret's doorway. At his request, yes, Margaret replied carefully, to assist with social obligations. The Dowager's gaze was penetrating. Be mindful of appearances, Mrs. Sloane. People will draw conclusions. I assure you, Your Grace, there is nothing improper in the arrangement. Propriety is determined by perception, not intention. The older woman's voice was cool. My son may not consider how your presence at his side will be interpreted, but you should. The warning lingered in Margaret's mind as their carriage approached the Pembrokes' estate. The Duke, seated across from her, seemed unusually relaxed. You're quiet, he observed. I'm considering your mother's concerns about my accompanying you today, Margaret admitted. And what were those concerns? That my presence might be misinterpreted. He studied her. And how might it be misinterpreted, Mrs. Sloane? The directness of the question made her uncomfortable. As suggesting a relationship beyond our professional arrangement. I see. His expression revealed nothing. And would that concern you? Margaret chose her words carefully. It would concern me if it compromised the purpose of my employment, or your standing in society. A diplomatic answer. His lips curved slightly, but not a complete one. Before she could respond, the carriage stopped. The moment passed. But Margaret felt its significance lingering between them. The garden party was elegant, but informal by aristocratic standards. Margaret remained mostly in the background, observing as the Duke fulfilled his social obligations. She noticed how differently he interacted with his peers compared to the candidates at Rivenhall. More guarded, less authentic. Mrs. Sloane, isn't it? A woman's voice interrupted her thoughts. Lady Pembroke, their hostess, approached with curious eyes. How unusual to see you in attendance. His Grace required assistance with some household matters, Margaret explained smoothly. Indeed? Lady Pembroke's tone suggested she didn't believe this explanation. It's merely that one doesn't typically see a Duke's household employee at social gatherings. Margaret felt her cheeks warm, but maintained her composure. I assure you, my presence is entirely professional. Of course, Lady Pembroke smiled thinly, though I must say, the Duke seems different of late, more engaged, people have noticed. Before Margaret could respond, the Duke himself appeared at her side. Lady Pembroke, he nodded. I trust you're not monopolizing Mrs. Sloane. I require her assistance with a matter. Naturally. Lady Pembroke's knowing look made Margaret's discomfort deepen. We were just discussing your recent house parties at Rivenhall. Such an innovative approach to hospitality. The Duke's expression remained neutral. Mrs. Sloane has been instrumental in managing those arrangements. As they walked away, Margaret felt the weight of curious gazes following them. Your Grace, perhaps I should return to the carriage. My presence is causing speculation. Let them speculate. His voice was calm. Their opinions matter far less than they believe. They paused near a secluded rose garden. The Duke turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, he said. About Lady Victoria's perfection and why it would be wrong to proceed. Margaret nodded, unsure where this was leading. What I didn't explain fully, he continued, is that I've discovered something unexpected during this process of selection. What is that, Your Grace? His gaze held her steadily. That there is someone at Rivenhall who already understands its needs perfectly. someone who sees beyond surfaces to truth, someone who, Your Grace. The Dowager Duchess's voice cut through the moment like a blade. She approached rapidly, her expression severe. A word, if you please. Immediately, the Duke's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Excuse me, Mrs. Sloane. As he walked away with his mother, Margaret stood frozen, her heart beating uncomfortably fast. The Dowager's intervention had prevented whatever the Duke had been about to say. But Margaret feared she knew what it might have been, and how dangerous such words could be for both of them. The ride back to Rivenhall passed in tense silence. The Duke had rejoined her after a lengthy conversation with his mother. His expression closed once more. Margaret wondered what had been said, what warnings or reminders had been issued. That evening, a note was delivered to her room. Please join me in the orangery tomorrow at noon. We must discuss the conclusion of your assignment. Rivenhall. Margaret stared at the paper, understanding that whatever happened tomorrow would determine far more than the Duke's marriage prospects. It would determine her own future as well. The orangery stood at the far end of the formal gardens, a cathedral of glass and iron filled with exotic plants and flooded with light. Margaret approached it at precisely noon, her steps measured despite the rapid beating of her heart. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with citrus blossoms. The Duke stood near the central fountain, his back to the entrance, hands clasped behind him. At the sound of her footsteps, he turned. Mrs. Sloane. His voice was formal, but something in his eyes suggested inner tension. Your Grace. She curtsied slightly. You wish to discuss the conclusion of my assignment? Yes. He gestured to a stone bench beside the fountain. Please be seated. Margaret sat, arranging her skirts with careful precision. The Duke remained standing, looking out through the glass walls to the gardens beyond. I've decided to end the selection process, he said finally. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. Because you found no suitable candidate. Because I found the process itself unsuitable. He turned to face her. It was a mistake to approach marriage as one might approach acquiring a piece of property. I see. Margaret kept her expression neutral. Then you'll pursue a more traditional courtship. No. He moved closer, his gaze direct. I've realized something during these weeks, Mrs. Sloane, Margaret. Something I should have understood from the beginning. The use of her given name sent a small shock through her. In all their weeks together, he had never once addressed her so personally. What is that, Your Grace? That what I truly seek cannot be found through methodical selection. His voice softened. It can only be recognized when it's already present. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. I'm not certain I understand. I think you do. He sat beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from him. Yesterday, at the garden party, my mother reminded me forcefully of my position, my responsibilities, the expectations of my title. As she should, Margaret said quietly. Perhaps. His expression was thoughtful. But she also reminded me that I have the power to define those responsibilities on my own terms. Margaret looked up, surprised. My first marriage taught me that following convention leads to emptiness, he continued. These past weeks have taught me that genuine understanding is possible, but not through artificial arrangements. Your Grace, Alaric, he interrupted. My name is Alaric. The intimacy of the request made her pause. That would be inappropriate. Why? Because of our different stations. A hint of frustration entered his voice. Or because acknowledging me as a man rather than a title makes this conversation more difficult. Margaret rose, moving toward a potted orange tree. Both, she admitted. What you seem to be suggesting is impossible, is it? He stood as well but didn't approach her. Tell me, Margaret, in all your careful observations and assessments, did you find a single woman who understood Rivenhall, or its master, as well as you do? She couldn't answer. You know this house, he continued. You've seen its emptiness and its potential. You understand its silences. Understanding is not enough, she said, finally turning to face him. Society has rules, expectations. Society can adapt. His voice was firm. I am not proposing something scandalous or impulsive. I am recognizing a truth that has grown between us, a possibility of genuine partnership. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Your mother would never accept it. The tongue would whisper that you married your employee, a widow without fortune or connection. Let them whisper. He stepped closer. My mother wants my happiness, though she defines it differently than I do. She will adjust. And what of the need for an heir, for advantageous connections? I need a wife who sees me clearly, he said simply, who brings truth rather than accommodation. The rest is secondary. The doors to the orangery opened suddenly, revealing the Dowager Duchess. She entered with regal bearing, her expression severe. I thought I might find you here, she said, looking between them. The household is in quite a state of confusion. Lady Victoria is inquiring about her interview, and the other young ladies are wondering why their host has disappeared. Alaric straightened. I was just explaining to Mrs. Sloane that the selection process is concluded. Is it indeed? The dowager's gaze fixed on Margaret. And what conclusion has been reached? Margaret began to speak, but Alaric interrupted. That will be announced formally this evening. His tone left no room for argument. For now, Mother, I would appreciate a moment to complete my conversation with Mrs. Sloane. The dowager's lips thinned, but she nodded stiffly. Very well. But remember your position, Alaric. Remember what is expected of the Duke of Rivenhall. She departed with a rustle of silk, leaving the air vibrating with tension. When the doors closed behind her, Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You see, it's impossible. Nothing worth having is impossible, Alaric said quietly, only difficult. What exactly are you proposing? Margaret asked, needing absolute clarity. That you become my wife. The directness of his statement took her breath away, not because it's convenient or expected, but because in you, I've found someone who understands silence without fearing it, someone who sees truth and speaks it, someone I could build a life with that contains meaning, not merely duty. Margaret felt the world shifting beneath her feet. This is madness. Is it? He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his eyes. Tell me honestly, have you not felt this understanding growing between us, this recognition? She couldn't deny it. From their first conversation in the library to their shared confidences about empty marriages. Something had been building, a bridge across different worlds. Yes, she admitted finally. But feeling is not enough to overcome the realities of our positions. Then let me be clear about reality. His voice was steady. I am the Duke of Rivenhall. I have the privilege and the burden of that title, but I am also Alaric Vale. A man who has lived in emptiness long enough to recognize its opposite when he finds it. He took her hand then. The first time he had touched her, his fingers were warm around hers. I don't offer romance or illusion, Margaret. I offer truth, partnership, the chance to build something real within these walls. Margaret looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. No longer the remote Duke, but a man asking a question that would change both their lives. And if I say yes, she asked softly, what then? Then we face whatever comes together, he answered, with clear eyes and honest hearts. In the sunlit orangery, surrounded by growing things, Margaret made her choice, not with passionate declarations or dramatic gestures, but with the quiet courage that had always been her strength. Yes, she said simply. Yes. That evening, in the formal drawing room, the Duke of Rivenhall made his announcement. The candidates, the household staff, and the Dowager Duchess listened in stunned silence as he declared the selection process complete. I am grateful for your participation, he told the young ladies, his tone respectful but firm. You have each demonstrated qualities any man would value. However, I have come to realize that the arrangement I proposed was fundamentally flawed. Lady Victoria's perfect composure showed the faintest crack of confusion. In what way, Your Grace? In presuming that the most important relationship in my household could be determined through a process more suited to acquiring property than building a life. His gaze moved to Margaret, who stood quietly near the door. True understanding cannot be manufactured or evaluated on a checklist. The Dowager Duchess's expression remained rigidly controlled, though Margaret could see the tension in her posture. I have therefore decided to pursue a different path, the Duke continued. One based on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than social convenience. A murmur ran through the room as he crossed to where Margaret stood, taking her hand. He turned to face the assembled company. Mrs. Margaret Sloane has agreed to become my wife. The wedding will take place next month, here at Rivenhall. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret felt the weight of every gaze, the shock, the calculation, the judgment. Lady Victoria recovered first, her breeding evident in her gracious nod. "I wish you both every happiness," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Others followed her lead, offering congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. The Dowager Duchess said nothing, but her rigid posture spoke volumes. Later that night, after the candidates had retired to pack for their departures the following day, Margaret found herself alone in the library. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike in their improbability. "There you are." Alaric's voice came from the doorway. He entered, closing the door behind him. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Not second thoughts," she said honestly, "but perhaps first realizations of what this will mean." He moved to stand beside her at the window. "The coming weeks won't be easy. There will be talk, speculation, disapproval." "I know." She turned to face him. "Your mother hasn't spoken a word to me since your announcement. She will in time." His expression was determined. "She values order and tradition, but she also values my judgment. Eventually, she'll recognize what I already know, that you belong here." Margaret wasn't so certain, but she appreciated his confidence, and society will adjust. He took her hand. "We're not the first couple to marry across social boundaries, merely the most recent. In a year, it will be old news." His pragmatism was oddly comforting. This was not a romantic fantasy, but a clear-eyed choice made by two people who understood exactly what they were doing. The following days brought precisely the challenges they had anticipated. Visitors who had been eager to call at Rivenhall suddenly remembered pressing engagements elsewhere. Letters arrived from distant relatives expressing concern about the Duke's hasty decision. Servants whispered when they thought no one could hear. Through it all, Alaric remained steadfast. He included Margaret in estate discussions, deferred to her judgment on household matters, and made it clear to everyone that her position was unassailable. Gradually, small shifts occurred. Mrs. Winters, after initial wariness, began to consult Margaret about menus and staffing with growing respect. The head gardener sought her opinion on plantings for the East Terrace. Even the Dowager Duchess, while still cool, began to acknowledge her presence with brief nods. One morning 3 weeks after the announcement, Margaret found a note on her breakfast tray. "The Orangery, 10 o'clock. When she arrived, she found Alaric waiting with an elderly man she didn't recognize. "Margaret, this is Mr. Hargrove, who has managed the Rivenhall accounts for 30 years, Alaric said. "He's brought the household ledgers for your review." Mr. Hargrove bowed. "Your Grace suggested you might wish to familiarize yourself with the estate's financial structure before the wedding." Margaret looked at Alaric, understanding the significance of this gesture. He wasn't merely making her his wife. He was making her a true partner in Rivenhall's management. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I would indeed." That afternoon, as they walked through the rose garden, Margaret found the courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind. "Are you certain you won't regret choosing me over someone who could have brought advantages to Rivenhall?" Alaric stopped, turning to face her. What advantage could possibly outweigh understanding, or trust, or the knowledge that the person beside you sees you clearly and chooses you anyway? His words, spoken without dramatic emphasis, but with absolute conviction, settled something within her. This was not a fairy tale of sudden passion or romantic rescue. It was something rarer and more valuable. A choice made with full awareness by two people who had learned the cost of empty correctness. The wedding took place as planned. A smaller affair than might have been expected for a duke, but dignified and proper. The Dowager Duchess attended with rigid composure, offering Margaret a single concession. "Make him happy, Mrs. Sloane. That is all I ask." "I will try," Margaret promised. "Not by pretending to be what I am not, but by being truthful in all things." A flicker of something, not quite approval, but perhaps understanding, crossed the older woman's face. Perhaps that is what he needs, after all, In the years that followed, Rivenhall House gradually transformed. Not dramatically, for neither Margaret nor Alaric were given to grand gestures, but meaningfully. Books lay open in more rooms. Conversations continued past the formal requirements of dinner. The orangery became a place where decisions were discussed and understood. Society eventually adjusted, as Alaric had predicted. The Duke and Duchess of Rivenhall were noted for their unusual partnership, but respected for the evident stability of their union. And if their love lacked the passionate drama of romantic tales, it possessed something perhaps more valuable: the quiet dignity of truth chosen with open eyes, and the deep satisfaction of being fully known and accepted. In a world that prized appearance over substance, they had found their way to something real, not despite their differences, but because of the understanding those differences had forged between them.